Alright, what's going on guys? Today we're going to be upgrading the Lightning Aggro Challenger Deck. We'll be doing it on a budget, a $30 budget in US dollars, and I know the currency isn't relevant to everyone, but just know that is what the decks sell for, at least what they're supposed to sell for by the MSRP, so that gives you a rough idea of what we're spending, $30. We're going to upgrade this deck, we're going to push it closer to the tier 1 decks, and hopefully have a pretty sweet deck for very little money. Now absolutely this deck is playable straight out of the box. You do not need to spend a ton of money to upgrade this, but for a little bit more money we can push it a little bit closer to the tier 1 deck and possibly give us an edge over those who either don't upgrade their challenger decks or who are just playing straight up tier 1 decks. So the Lightning Aggro deck is the ever popular mono red aggro deck that has been performing very well at the competitive level. And you know what? This deck is basically done. I mean, the tier 1 deck is already somewhat cheap, at least compared to things like, Soul Tie and Esper Control. We don't have to spend money on dual lands, so this deck is already pretty cheap even if it's built to tier. And this Lightning Aggro deck basically has almost everything that we need to have a tier 1 deck. The only thing this deck is missing is some of the more recent cards that were released with the release of Ravnica Allegiance. Those cards weren't out yet when these decks were being designed, so yeah, it's just missing some of the updates from that set. We're basically just going to update this deck. I mean, this is basically built to tier from before that set was released, and we're going to update it with some uncommons basically, and we're going to be there almost, pretty close anyway. So that's pretty nice. So yeah, let's just get right into it. First off, we're going to take out 2 lava coils for 2 Skewer the Critics. The coils can only target creatures, which is kind of a problem because a lot of the time we're going to want to go straight to our opponent's face, and this is also really bad if we're ripping cards off the top of the deck with Experimental Frenzy. We hit this, and if our opponent doesn't have creatures, then that stops us in our tracks. So Skewer the Critics is just, it's way better. For Spectacle, it's 3 damage for a single mana, which is fantastic. It's a lightning bolt and standard, kind of great. It's not going to stop our chain with Experimental Frenzy. It's really good. However, important note here, hang on to these lava coils because we will be moving them to the sideboard later in this video. They are very useful against things like Rekindling Phoenix and Arclight Phoenix. So we want them in our sideboard so we can bring them in those matchups, but we just don't need them in the main board because most of the time it's not necessary. Next, we're going to take out a Banefire for a risk factor. Banefire just isn't efficient in this deck. We're not looking to have a ton of mana in play, so we're not likely to be able to cast this for more than 2 or 3. Risk factor just makes so much more sense. It either deals 4 damage for 3 mana, or our opponent makes the terrible mistake of letting us draw a bunch of cards, filling our hand with more gas and more burn spells. Plus it can be cast twice with Jumpstart. So yeah, it's pretty good. Banefire could be moved to the sideboard though as a finisher against Esper Control. If you want to do that, yeah, go for it. Take out, one of the mares, one of the, like the diamond mare or something. Take out something like that, it's fine. If you're playing against Esper Control a lot and you're having all of your stuff countered and the game's going, 10 turns deep and you're getting piles and piles of mana, then in that case, Banefire can be good. So it could be a good sideboard card. I just don't think we need it in the main board. Next, we're actually going to take out 3 mountains for 3 Light Up the Stage. Yep, 3 mountains. These mono red decks usually play 19 or 20 lands, and Wizards of the Coast gave us 22, so yeah, it's not necessary. And Light Up the Stage is the perfect replacement because it can help us dig for lands if we do find ourselves short. Anyway, it's kind of awesome, though it's a little bit wonky, so let me explain. If we trigger Spectacle, we can cast it for a single mana. We get to flip 2 cards off the top of our deck, and until the end of our next turn, not this turn, we get to go through the rest of this turn and our next turn, we get to cast those cards, just straight up cast them, and all for just 1 mana, which means that we're basically just filling our hand with more gas. Gas is so important with red, especially aggro decks and burn decks. They run out of cards quickly. You're flinging burn spells, you're playing a bunch of small creatures, and you leave yourself without a hand. And this just lets us fill up with more gas. Gas is important, and Light Up the Stage is kind of great. So very useful. And that's actually it. Literally that's it. Like I said, the deck was basically complete. We just needed these few cards from Ravnica Allegiance. Skewer the Critics and Light Up the Stage were both really good in this deck, and they just came out after these decks were being designed initially. So yeah, pretty cool. If You could also probably replace the Rekindling Phoenix in the deck with either another Risk Factor or another Skewer the Critics, but I'll leave that up to you. So anyway, we do have some changes to make to the sideboard. First, we're going to take out 2 Lightning Mares for the 2 Lava Coils we took out earlier. This is a free upgrade because we already had those. We're just going to move them to the sideboard. So yeah, free upgrade I guess, but it's really useful against those obnoxious Phoenixes that are popular and standard, so totally happy to have access to these. The Lightning Mares, they're good against the mono blue tempo deck, but they're not 100% necessary. I also think it's a good idea to take out 2 Diamond Mares for 2 Dire Fleet Daredevils. Though this is a little bit expensive, so it's kind of an optional upgrade, but we haven't spent hardly any money on this, so I think the $10 or so that we're going to spend here is well worth it. But it is a sideboard card, and I know some people don't want to spend that much on sideboard stuff, so you know, that's fine. But here's the thing, the Diamond Mare is really only good in the mirror match, that is to say against other mono red decks, because it gives us a creature that can block all of their creatures except the Chain Whirler, and it also gains a bunch of life. So basically you put this in play, it can block the Pyromancer, it can block the Wizard, it can block, you know, it can block everything. So it basically turns off some of your opponent's attackers and also allows you to start gaining life, so it'll give you an edge in the mirror match. But here's the thing, the Daredevil is also really good in the mirror match since it allows you to cast one of your opponent's burn spells. When it comes into play, you get to target a spell in their graveyard and then you can cast it. So you can target one of your opponent's shocks or lightning strikes, whatever, and blow up one of their creatures or fling it at their face. So it's really good in the mirror match, but it's also really good in some of the other matchups like the Golgari and Esper decks, since you can cast their removal spells. Diamond Mare is really good in the mirror match, but it's basically completely useless against all of the other decks. Maybe it's okay against mono white, but it's bad against Golgari, it's bad against Esper. No, you don't really need Diamond Mare in those matchups, but Dire Fleet Daredevil is good against pretty much everything. In fact, it's so good that some people are actually main decking it. It's not common, but it's good against Golgari, it's good against Esper, it's good against mono red, it's kind of so-so against mono white, but you know, Dire Fleet Daredevil really good against pretty much everything, and Diamond Mare is, you know, it's much more narrow in what it's good against. So overall, it's just much more versatile. But again, it's like $10 or so for this upgrade, so leave it up to you. If you're not playing against things like Esper Control and Golgari midrange a lot, maybe it's not completely necessary. Like if no one at your local gaming store is playing Golgari Control or Esper Control, so you never play against those decks, but you do have multiple people playing mono red, then maybe there's an argument to keep the Diamond Mare. But if you have a much more wider range of decks at your local gaming store or whatever, then I think the Dire Fleet Daredevil is much more useful. And that's all of our upgrades. Yeah, like I said, the deck was basically done right out of the box. We just needed a few little updates. Now, if you want to build this up to tier, I'll leave a link in the description below to a tier 1 deck, but it's pretty close to what we have actually. I think the only difference is that we still have Rekindling Phoenix and the main board, and those are usually moved to the sideboard or they're not played at all, and they're usually replaced with a second Risk Factor. Plus, another thing about the tier 1 decks is some people play 2 Experimental Frenzies, some people play 3 or 4. So yeah, that's the thing about tier 1 decks, is that everyone has preferences. Some people want more Experimental Frenzies, some people want less, some people will like Rekindling Phoenix, some people don't want that and they just want more burn spells. You know, that's the thing, you can kind of always adjust the ratios a little bit to your liking. For me, I'm going to leave Rekindling Phoenix in there, but you know, that's up to you. But either way, what we have now is fantastic, didn't cost that much, and yeah, it's a great deck. You will definitely do well at your local gaming store. Now, I will say that decks have started to splash a second color into this deck, either green or black, mostly for sideboard cards, but the black deck has some main board stuff too. So let's look at these really quick. So first off, with green, if you want to splash green, you need Stomping Grounds and Rootbound Crags. Needless to say, these are dual lands, so they are very expensive. This is not a cheap upgrade. In fact, they cost more than the original deck just for these 8 lands. However, doing so will give you access to a couple of sideboard cards, namely Cindervines and Thrash Threat. Cindervines is really good against Izzet Phoenix as well as Nexus of Fate. Nexus of Fate in particular is great because the deck is looking to cast Nexus over and over again to take infinite turns, but with Cindervines they will take damage every time they cast it, so they can only take so many turns before they die. And the split card just gives us removal and access to a beatdown creature. So you're spending a lot of money on dual lands just for these couple of sideboard cards, but that is very popular with competitive decks right now. Now, if you want to splash black, on the other hand, you'll need Blood Crypts and Dragon Skull Summons. Once again, the dual lands are very expensive, but if you want to drop this kind of cash on your mana base, you're going to get access to Rixmaddie Reveler and Sovereign's Bite. The Reveler is another way to fill your hand with gas because you can cast it when you're about out of cards and draw 3 more. Sovereign's Bite is great because it's 2 mana to deal 3 damage and gain 3 life. So it's kind of like a lightning strike, but the 3 points of life gain can make a huge difference when you're playing against other aggro decks. If you're playing against another burn deck, for example, if they're playing lightning strikes and you're playing Sovereign's Bite, you kind of come out ahead, right? Because you're both dealing 3 damage to each other, but you're gaining 3 life back. And that can make a difference in the mirror match if you're both just racing to deal 20 points of damage as quick as possible. So yeah, it's completely unnecessary, but it's an option if you want to drop, all that money on those dual lands. But I do want to say though, that the red-black version is the least popular and least successful build of these 3 decks, at least at the moment. It varies and changes with time, but most decks are going with the green splash for the sideboard tech against spell-based decks, and the mono red deck is still holding strong. So those are the 2 main versions of the deck, the most successful versions, and then the red-black deck is more of a fringe deck that crops up from time to time. But yeah, anyway, again, as I keep saying, that's completely unnecessary. What we have right here is totally playable at FNM. It's pretty close to the mono red tier 1 deck. It's very close. I mean, this deck looks pretty much done. If this top 8 at a GP, I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe the sideboard could use some tweaking a bit, but I mean, everyone builds this differently. Like I said, people play different amounts of Experimental Frenzies, people play different amounts of Rekindling Phoenix and Risk Factors, so this could totally be a viable competitive deck. But yeah, if you do want to see what the competitive decks look like, I would highly recommend checking out the description to this video, which is just down below, because I'm going to leave a ton of links to various deck lists so you can see the different ways that you can build your deck going forward. I'll leave links to the mono red decks as well as the ones with green and black splashes so you can have an idea of what they look like, but it's completely unnecessary. You have a fantastic deck out of the box. With these upgrades, you have an even better deck. So this deck is pretty fantastic as you see it, but if you do want to take it even further, yeah, those links will be there in the description below. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.